Hello, regulatory rebels. Welcome back to another episode of Device and Conquer, the podcast that breaks down the medtech regulations so it doesn't break your brain.
Last week, we took on EU's MDR, the good, the bad, all our feelings. You heard a lot of them. But today, we're headed back west, and this episode is FDA 101, the other regulatory giant. Buckle up.
So, who even is the FDA?
So, FDA is the US Food and Drug Administration. It oversees medical devices as well. So you hear food and drug, but it's really medical devices as well through the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, CDRH. They make sure that everything from pacemakers to smartphone apps to tongue depressors, anything that could be a medical device is safe and effective. And they are the, regulatory body that really helps enforce any of those rules.
Yeah. And more than that, they don't just approve products, they regulate the entire life cycle, from the early design stages and testing to the submissions to the manufacturing, labeling, post-market surveillance in the way of complaints, recalls, um, medical device reports. Is the whole package.
Yeah. So where do you start? If you are an FDA or if you have a medical device company, the very first place to start regulating your product is determining what classification it is. So FDA uses a three-class system based on risk, and it's kind of you can make it a comparison to a lot of things. You have class one products. These are low risk, minimal controls. They're things like, as I said before, tongue depressors, some scalpels, some surgical equipment that's just stainless steel tools. These are G-rated products. They are easy to get to market. The risk is low. You've got class two, which is kind of like moderate risk with oversight. So these can have some impact to patients or cause harm. You'd be surprised what falls into this category. So you can have everything from your contact lenses to
That
infusion
really
pumps.
surprised me because I would have thought that contact lenses would be a class three, like a high risk, because they are in Europe, and you think about they can make you blind.
Yep. So, even what else is surprising is a lot of radiation products fall in class two, whereas in other markets they are up classified because there's a lot of history about radiation in the US. It was a medical advance, you know, predominantly here very early on. Um, but yeah, the class two bucket is a huge swath, and it, like I said, it covers everything from contact lenses to infusion pumps to, some implantables and radiation
Everybody's favorite surgical masks.
surgical mask, spirometers, which for people who don't know what a spirometer is, that is the plastic piece that your doctor has you blow in to measure your lung volume. That is a class two 510(k) product. But these are PG-13s. Most movies lands in here. Some are a little more edgy than others. Some seem to make you guess, does it even really need a PG-13 rating? But it's there anyway. And then
Yep.
you have the highest risk. These are life-sustaining implantables. I mean, this is what you think of when you think of cutting-edge technology. Pacemaker, heart valves, long-term implantables.
Life supporting, life sustaining.
Yep.
It's going to always be class three PMA. And also the risk of misdiagnosis. Say you make a test for cancer and your reliability isn't good enough. Like the test for cancer is going to be a class three PMA because of the risk of misdiagnosis, could cause death.
Yep.
Mhm. So to further, just to give you a perspective of like kind of what the market looks like across these classes, class one makes up about 40 to 50%. Class two makes up about 40%. And then class threes only make up about 5% of the products that are regulated by FDA. And then to make it even more complicated, there are all kinds of exemptions. Like, for example, you can have a class one device that is good manufacturing practices exempt and only has to register and list and have a complaint procedure. You can have a class one device that's 510K exempt, which most are. Or you could have a class one device that requires a 510K. And same thing for class two devices. Most of them require 510Ks, but there are some that don't require a 510K. So you
Yep.
really have to be savvy when you're reading the regulations and finding product codes about how all of these exemptions and requirements, and if you exceed the exemption, what does that mean for your regulatory strategy? So it can be quite complex.
It's very complex because unlike also what we talked about in Europe where they use classification rules to kind of determine what your classification is, FDA doesn't do that. So you have class one, two, three, like Michelle said, but you also have another two-part system to kind of help get you that regulatory map. Let's talk about FDA product codes because they're so unique to the US.
Mhm.
And it's really their FDA uses a three-letter product code system to basically describe your device underneath a regulation. And what Michelle was saying about having, a class one product that might need a 510K, also called a class one reserve device, you find that information by knowing what your product code is. So surgical gloves are a great example of that because surgical gloves are technically class one, but they require a 510K and full design
Mhm.
controls. And so it's
Say,
not that,
say you take a class one device that's 510K exempt, and then you make a software for
yes.
it, or an app, then now you've exceeded the exemption that was intended, and you have to do a 510K because soft devices with software require 510Ks, period.
Yep. So you determine the class of your product, class one, two, or three. That's kind of a starting point. But the product code is really where you get the meat of your requirements. So, depending on your product code, it can tell you your consensus standards, it can tell
Mhm.
you if you have special controls. It will guide you to the wording of your regulation, which we'll talk about a little bit later because regulations also deserve their own little section in this podcast. It tells you what your submission requirements are like. Um, and it can even tell you uh, you know, uh a lot of history on that product itself, by seeing what other products are in kind of companion product codes under a regulation.
Mhm. And it can be a little confusing because one regulation can have multiple product codes. Like I think like example FXX for surgical masks falls underneath a regulation for like that has 24 total product codes underneath it. And they cover just a whole variety of stuff. And so you can't make an assumption just because something falls within a certain product code or a certain regulation that they're all going to have the same requirements and expectations. Because like I said, of those 24 product codes that fell underneath that one regulation, it's all over the map. There's some that's class one, 510K exempt, class one that 510K required, class two that's 510K required, class two that's 510K exempt, all underneath a single regulation number.
And
So
we've mentioned regulation a lot. Tell me a little bit about what a FDA product regulation is, because it's also a little bit different. We talked about how regulations are laws that are written. But it would surprise, I think, a lot of people, particularly who have experience classifying devices in other countries,
mhm.
how FDA structures this combination of a product code and what is a regulation that goes along with
Right.
them.
Right. Well, it all starts at the regulation level, and that's because that is published in the Code of Federal Regulations. And so it starts there. A regulation number defines like generally the intended use for the device, sometimes the physical properties, and then the controls that apply to it in those different circumstances. So that's kind of like the parent, and that is actually, the law. Then the product codes that fall underneath it are like subsets of different types of products that the FDA thinks could fall underneath that parent regulation number.
So you
Um,
mentioned surgical masks. This is a good example for us. So there's a regulation, and what is the regulation kind of covering? Is it all types of masks that the regulation is controlling? So you have surgical masks, but what other types of product codes
mhm,
kind of fall under that so that you can give the audience kind of an example of, okay, a regulation is this straightforward, but then here's the whole swath of things that can fall
mhm.
underneath it.
Right. Well, in terms of surgical masks, what we think of in terms of just fluid, like a fluid barrier, is one particular type of product code. But then say we take that mask and we say we want to add an antimicrobial agent to it. And so then that is yet another product code because you've changed an indication and added a product feature for the being antibacterial, antiviral. Well, then what if we want to say this is for children? Well, pediatric has its own product code and a different set of requirements. So it's really important not only that you understand your intended use, but you understand the indications and combinations for it. So an indication can be like a contact duration. It can be a specific patient population, like pediatrics. It can be a particular anatomical location. All of those things are innuendos that can change the product code that you fit into.
And just to broaden this out, we're talking about masks under a regulation, but I actually pulled it up, and that regulation actually is for a whole host of surgical apparel.
Mhm,
So we're just talking about the mask product codes, but if you think about a regulation as being kind of a huge umbrella term, under this, you have things like shoe covers, you have surgical gowns. You got surgical gowns for use in actual surgery versus just ones that go on the patient and ones that go on the surgeon. Believe it or not, they have different controls. Um, and like Michelle was already saying, there's a bunch of mask variants. And so that regulation can be extremely broad and cover a whole host of different types of technologies, if you will. Because obviously, a surgical gown and a surgical mask, while they have similar function, the testing and the rigors and your design for them is totally different because, they're different pieces of apparel.
mhm. Well, so let's talk about substantial equivalence.
Oh, the other really oddball FDA approach, substantial equivalence. Let's talk about it.
Mhm. So, substantial equivalence is an interesting term because it doesn't mean identical.
Yeah.
It means similar or same in a way that doesn't raise new questions of safety and efficacy.
So, so substantial equivalence. This is very unique to FDA. And I think it's important to hear a little bit of history here. So the way that FDA has set up their medical device, regulatory pre-market approvals and clearances with 510(k)s is that they want to compare your device to something that is already legally marketed for class 2 510(k) products. And that is the substantial equivalence argument that Michelle is setting us up to talk about. You basically take a device that's already cleared and legally marketed under a product code and regulation, and you compare your new product to those similar features. It's a little bit of a catch-22, but the important part to know is that it doesn't mean that you're identical. It means that you're not raising new questions of safety and efficacy. Because how does innovation flourish under a substantial equivalence setup, Michelle?
Mhm. Well, it's substantial equivalence and selecting the right predicate is almost an art. But and then if you think about it too, you know, a substantial equivalence is almost like saying we're a Me Too product. But yet all companies want to say we're innovative, we're
Yeah.
novel. They have all these words around things that don't mean substantially equivalent. They actually mean it's new and different, and it's likely to raise new questions of safety and efficacy. So it's like for marketing purposes and for the US PTO, you're trying to make one argument like we are so new and different, we deserve IP around this and like intellectual property. But then you have to turn around and tell the FDA, oh, we are so much like this guy over here that we are not new and innovative, raising new questions of safety and efficacy. So it's like this real balance. And so that's why it's so important. Not only we've talked about intended use, we've talked about indications for use, claims.
Yeah.
Claims are the other big bogey that is going to affect your regulatory strategy and your predicate selection.
I mean, medical device innovation is literally a regulatory wrestling match between what your regulatory team wants to say and what your IP and marketing team wants to say. And sometimes you just watch the battle and see who's going to win because one side almost always has to lose a little bit for what they're doing, right? So, from a regulatory perspective, it's just like you say, you don't want to say that your safety, you're raising any new questions of safety and efficacy. It's from a commercialization standpoint, it's much easier to get your clearance to actually sell by being a Me Too product. But from an actual sales and IP coverage, it's very hard to get any
Reimbursement.
or reimbursement. It's very hard to get any sort of utility patent that is readily enforceable because you end up having to rely on design patents, and even your design patents can be questioned if you're too much of this Me Too product. And so you have legal over here saying, but your IP, you need to market it this way. And then you have your marketing team saying, I need to be able to say these things to get to market and get some traction.
Yeah.
Then you have regulatory being like, okay, everyone needs to calm down. We're the referee here. You need to be playing like within the rules and we can still have a good game, but like maybe you're not going to have as many scoring touchdowns as you want. So it's kind of this very artistic balance of meeting everyone's needs and this dynamic interpretation of products.
And that kind of brings us to another point that we talk about often, and that is treating regulatory like it is a strategic and competitive advantage and incorporating it early on because you're right, all of those entities that you just talked about within an organization are used to usually duke it out, but to be really successful, they
Yeah.
work together as a team that respect each other and their roles to help make the whole package successful. And so like right from the beginning, you need to be having conversations simultaneously about early regulatory strategy, early ideas for reimbursement, early ideas for uh, what testing might need to be done, and start thinking through those things as a group and as a cohesive unit so that you're all moving in lockstep, and don't, maybe invalidate your patent or put something in your patent that you don't realize requires $500,000 worth of testing,
Yeah.
and then
See it
now you
happen.
can't fulfill the requirements of your patent because you can't afford to do that because you didn't know it was going to be that much. So,
We've definitely seen that happen, and we'll talk more about, using regulatory for a strategic advantage and things that Michelle and I see as both consultants and having work experiences that can set people up for success. But yeah, substantial equivalence is very tricky and because it's so US specific to claim that you're as good as something that's already on the market, that doesn't sound very appealing. But that is how 510(k)s are handled. Let's talk about PMAs. They're the big horse, or de novos even. Why don't we mention a little bit about de
Yeah,
novo and PMAs?
yeah. So, de novo, you heard me earlier when we were talking about that substantial equivalence idea and the words that people throw out like innovative, novel, etc. Well, in FDA language, when they hear that, they think new. They have a term for it called de novo, which means of new. And so if you cannot find another predicate that is similar enough to your device in technology, in indications for use, in intended use, then or you raise new questions of safety and efficacy because of the differences, then FDA says you will fall underneath this of new because there's not a regulation that exists most of the time. So the de novo process ultimately ends with the FDA writing a brand new regulation and creating a brand new product code so that now that you now become the first predicate for subsequent 510(k)s. So the next people after you can do a 510(k) because now you've set that precedence or that predicate standard.
And de novos are, in general, much more burdensome than a traditional 510(k). In the US, for many devices, you don't have to necessarily provide clinical data. For de novos, that's usually not true. And a de novo it is a significant step underneath a PMA, but it does have a lot more controls. It requires a lot more funding, usually a lot more testing, and a much longer review time.
Yeah. So
So,
just so like in comparison, the average 510(k) is around 200 days in review time. The de novos are around 400, PMAs around 800. So it
yep.
all literally doubles in review time of that thing. So it's really the Mount Everest of submissions, if you will. So, and back in the day when you had to print paper copies and ship it to the FDA, it is literally like three-inch ring by not three, I'm sorry, 33-inch ring binders that some people would print it and then it was cheaper to put it in their car and
And
drive it to
drive it.
FDA than to ship it.
Yep.
So
Yeah,
it's pretty crazy.
I was talking to some people and they were talking about that were East Coast based and they would absolutely put it in their car and drive it because it was cheaper than shipping all that paper. Because you didn't have to submit one copy, you had to submit two.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that this is a good stopping place and stay with us. I think next time we'll go into the differences between FDA and the European medical device regulation, the difference in how they approach classifications, and the difference in the audit methodologies and requirements.